In this tutorial, we'll be creating a sprint ability using the gameplay ability system, and we'll be implementing this in a Lyra-based project. Another thing that we'll do is we'll empower our players with the option to either tap to sprint or hold to sprint. So then we have to hold down the input and let go to deactivate the sprint. We'll be touching a lot on input actions in this tutorial. Okay, so I'm gonna navigate to my favorite map, so Common Maps Shooter Gym. I've opened up a fresh new Lyra project for Unreal Engine 5.3, and I just named it Sprint Lyra. So go ahead and open your input data for your character. So in my case, I will just search in the world setting tabs in the shooter game elimination. I'm just going to go ahead and open that up, and then your default pawn data will be right here. So this is the first part of setting up the input for our characters so that they can sprint. So let's go ahead and browse to it and open it. So we want to set up the input to our hero. So it will be here in the input category. So let's browse to that and then open that up. Okay, so this is all the input data for your hero. And the move is already there, the auto run, the jump ability. So our input will be tied to an ability. So we can add it just the same way that Lyra has it set up for the jump. And there's also a dash, which we will change the input binding because it's surely bound to the same key. So let's go ahead and add an input action to our input data hero, or your own input data. Okay, so you'll notice that there is nothing here. What we want to do is we want to add an input action in the same spot as the input action jump, because that makes sense. It's all inputs and actions. So that is under your content input actions. And let's go ahead and create a new input action. So right click and then under input action. And then we'll call this one IA_sprint. Okay, so this is essentially a trigger for some input has happened, do something. So we just need it here. So the next part we need is the input tag, which will be bound to the ability itself. So let's go ahead and add an input tag. So click on the down drop button, and then let's add a sub tag. And I'll call this one just sprint. And with 5.3 now, you have to specify your location. So if I look at jump, I can see that it is in the default gameplay tags.ini. So I'm just going to add it the same place. So input tag, add sub tag, and then my source, this is fine. So sprint. Okay, and then unfortunately it won't add it immediately. So you'll just have to click that again and then click on sprint. So now our input tag is set. What we want to do next is open up our input action sprint and give ourselves some triggers. So these are essentially the trigger that will trigger this input. So you have a few options, and later in this tutorial we'll actually be adding our own. So you'll see that this is very customizable. So in our case, for the first iteration of our sprint, I just want us to just create a tap trigger. So what will this happen is that when you're pressing down your shift or your gamepad, I guess the left thumbstick would be good. So when you're holding it down and you release it within 0.2 seconds, it will then trigger a tap trigger. So if you have an ability that's triggerable by input, this is what the trigger would be. So in my case, I do like that default. That's okay. We could always tweak this. And another thing we can do that I noticed that the other input actions have. So if we look at the jump, you'll notice that they use they specify in the user settings, the player mappable key settings. So this is what's taken in the options menu, just so that the player can map their own bindings. So in this case, I will add a setting for it. So you just click on none and then player mappable key settings. It shows that it's experimental, so I'm not sure. I guess use it as long as it works. Okay, and then I'll just give it a name, sprint. In our case, it might just be toggle sprint. And toggle sprint is good. Okay, there's other options. Display category. There's nothing here, so it'll probably be in a default category somewhere. Okay, so now before we even bind the ability itself, let's go ahead and bind what key does trigger this input action. So to do that, I'm just going to go ahead and find the reference viewer for the jump. I really like to use the reference viewer because Lyra is really just a big load of examples. And it's good to see how everything relates to each other. So the input action, you can see it's being used in this input mapping context. So let's go ahead and open that. So you can either browse to asset. In my case, I will just Control E to open it up. And it's a bit finicky. You have to have your cursor right on it when you press Control E. Okay. And then I'm going to open that up. And then you can see the jump has space bar, face button. So I'm just going to add another mapping. So this will just map the input action that we just created to a key that or a gamepad button. So sprint, I'm just going to use the shift key. So you can press it and then click the key that you like, or you can always just select, or you can select a value through here, through searching. So let's say you don't have access to a gamepad at the moment, then you can search it that way. Okay, and then key value, I'm gonna choose the gamepad left thumbstick button. And then what's great is that your triggers, they are inherited from your input action. If ever you don't want that to happen, you can set your behavior to override the settings or ignore the settings. In our case, I actually do like these triggers from the input action. What's nice is you can see it here. You could add also your own triggers if you'd like. If there's a certain input mapping context you'd prefer, maybe there's an alternate scheme and you could swap between the two. And then one of them wouldn't use a tap, it could use like a hold. So the player's controller or keyboard mappings is very customizable. Okay, so now without even having added the ability to the player, I'll just show that. I'll just use God mode. So when I press escape, options, you'll notice that there is a new entry in your default experiences called toggle sprint, and it will show your keyboard mouse. It won't show your gamepad though, because the gamepad is not boundable. But technically from the keyboard, you could always have two different mappings if your player wants that. Okay, so now that we have a player mappable input event for sprint, I'm just going to stop this. And let's see where the sprint actually has its ability. So I'm just going to go back to the input data hero. You can see there's the input tag jump. I'll search for references. And there it is. So the ability set for the shooter hero is where you'll define which abilities and effects your hero has, or your pawn. So Control E. Okay, and then you have your granted gameplay abilities, and there's our jump. I'm gonna add an element, and we haven't created our ability yet, but you can go ahead and use the sprint input tag that we created just now. Okay, and let's go ahead and just see where the hero jump is located. That seems like a good spot. So I'm gonna go ahead and right click and then add a blueprint class. And then the Lyra gameplay ability is already in the main page, which is nice. So I'm going to click that. And then GA hero underscore sprint. If you'd want your non-hero pawns, like let's say NPCs, to also have this, maybe don't call it hero sprint, just keep it generic. So I'm going to open that and just have it not really do much. I'm just going to have it print out a string. So sprint has been activated. And then it's always good to end the ability. So it's good to make sure it ends correctly. Okay, and then back in my ability set shooter hero, I can go scroll down and I'm gonna use this here. Or I could have just clicked this button. Yeah, so let me just use that. Okay, use the shift. So the problem here is that shift is also bound to the dash. But you can see that the ability still has been activated, so they can coexist. But I do want to have a different button for them. So I'm going to go back in the input mapping context default, and then in your dash, let's go ahead and change that to maybe V. And then for the sprint, RB is actually used by throwing a grenade. Another way to see what's bound to what is you can go God mode, show debug, enhance input. So I haven't figured yet how to make that view smaller, but it's nice to see what's bound to what. So in our case, so the ability dash is gamepad right shoulder, and which is overridden by the melee input action. It's nice to just debug. Okay, so I'll just turn that off. So yeah, the gamepad button, there's not that many buttons. I can see that the right thumbstick is not being used, so I think I'll switch it to that. Okay, so the dash ability, I'll click here and just press the right thumbstick button. There you go. Now we're dashing on the right thumbstick. Okay, so now that we have all our inputs and ability set up, we can surely close out all these blueprints. Okay, so I'm going to close the input mapping context. We won't be needing that one. The jump. I'll keep this one because we'll use it later. And we can close that. Input hero, goodbye. Okay, so we pretty much just need our input action sprint and our GA hero sprint. So since this is a tap input, what we're going to do is instead of ending the ability right away, what you can do is you can wait input press, and this will essentially just wait for that trigger to happen. So the input that's bound to this ability, so we'll just wait for it to be pressed. Okay, so whenever you press, let's just make sure to print a string. So sprint has been deactivated. save and compile. Okay, so when I play, I press the shift. Oh, I died. So what this just showed is that when I died, the ability didn't end correctly. So another thing we need to add is a tag for the input. So it's a tag for so that the relationship and tags knows that this ability should be canceled when you die. So I'm going to create a new ability tag. So ability type and then action. So you can see all these different actions here. So I'm going to add a sub tag sprint. And this is a good source. Okay, and then I'm just going to click it so that it's added to the ability tags. And what this will do, if we search for relationship, tag relationships, there's a rule over here that anything that owns the action tag, so ability type action, its activation will be blocked by these tags. So you won't be able to sprint when you're dead. And let me see. I think there's another rule. So for death, so for GA hero death, so GA hero death, it will essentially block abilities with this tag, and it will also cancel the abilities with this tag. So you're kind of, it's kind of double checking, just making sure that abilities can't happen when you're dead and they end correctly. Without you having to check for death and wait for tag added and all that in your abilities, which is pretty nice. So I'm going to save that. I don't need this. Okay, so let me play. I press shift, sprint has been activated. I press shift again, it has been deactivated, so our ability ended. And I'll just try to see what happens when I start sprinting. So sprint has been activated. And then when I die, the ability ends by itself. And then when I press shift again, sprint has been activated. So the ability ended correctly. So now for the meat and potatoes, what do we actually want to happen when you activate sprint? So for this bit, I took inspiration from GA aim down sights. So this ability, whenever the player is aiming down sights, it affects the player's speed. So essentially what it does is it gets activated, it changes the camera mode, and which in our case, we could also have a camera mode when you're sprinting so that it just looks more intense or something. So all it does is that it saves the previous max walk speed, but then it sets it to the max walk speed times a certain multiplier. So we will do exactly the same logic. And then when the ability ends, we make sure to set the walking speed back to this here. So if you want more of an attribute-based solution, I will link a video which I think covers it really well. Yeah, but for now, let's just go ahead and copy paste this section here. So copy, okay, and then right after our sprint has been activated, let's paste this. So max walk speed default. Let's go ahead and compile. And then what we can do is we can just right click on it, create a variable, compile, save. And then this one I'll create a variable as well, but I will rename it. So I will name it sprint multiplier. So while aim down sight was surely slowing it down by half. We will, well, make it maybe 2 times. So when you sprint 2 times. And then I guess just for making sure it's an okay value, we can set the value range minimum to 0.1 just to make sure we don't have 0. And then same with the slider range. Okay. And then wait for input. And then on AND ability, let's go get that logic as well. So that's what we do. Okay, and then hooking it up to our logic. And another thing, just to make sure that I've noticed, is that you just want to make sure that by that point, your character is valid. So your pawn isn't dead yet. So I'm just going to add a is valid check. It might be overkill, but I think I was getting errors before. Okay, so let's go ahead and test this. So when I play, tap shift, and it's nice because it changes your max speed. There's acceleration, but the deceleration is pretty immediate. Okay, so if all you wanted was the toggle, then there you have it, and it should look pretty okay in multiplayer. So net mode, I'll change play as a listen server. And I want to play new editor windows. Okay. So where's my friend? Oh, there it is. Okay, so I press shift. There it goes. Pretty fast. And then the client. It goes really fast. Ooh. So there might be some replication jitter because as soon as you change your movement speed and your character movement, maybe it didn't sync up, maybe it didn't get the input in time. So maybe aim down side could get away with it because it was slowing you down. So there might be needed some more iteration and more solutions for having properly replicated max speed changes. If you want your sprint to happen when the player has the key or the button pressed down, we can again take an example from aim down sights, and that we can just wait until the input has been released. So to see the aim down sights, I'm going to search for the reference viewer and then the ability set. And where are we? So aim down sights is using this here. So I'm going to search for references. And then in your input data, oh, that's interesting. So it's as part as in add-on. So in our case, we want to see what they use for aim down sights. So the input action aim down sights, let's open it up. It's always good to take example from existing things. It doesn't have any trigger. If there are no triggers bound, then it will use the down trigger. So that is, we can actually use the same thing. So if we go back to our sprint input action, if we in fact just delete this tap here, then we'll get the same behavior. Okay, so I'm just gonna save this. I don't think I changed anything here. Oh, I had added a trigger. Okay, so back to our hero sprint. So instead of input wait press, what we could do is we could just wait input release. Okay, so on release, sprint has been deactivated. Okay, so I'm just going to play with one player. Okay, so I'm holding it down. I let go. Holding it down, let go. So yeah, there's the hold works. And I think we could support both at the same time. It depends on the threshold of your input. So we might have to tweak a little bit. So we could always just have these two. So this should be good. Okay. But if we support both, we could add some guards just to make sure that the tasks finish. So I'm going to right click on wait input release, promote to variable. So wait input release. And then this one is wait input press. Okay. And then at the end, we can get it. So control. And then you can convert to a validated get, which is really neat. So if it's valid, we want to end the task. And then same with this one. Oh, same with that one. End task. Okay. And then in our input action sprint, instead of just having 0 triggers, we'll re-add our tap. And then we also have the down. Okay, and then this one has only fires after 0.5. Okay, so if you tap, that should work. Okay, let's see if that works. Okay, so I'm using the shift. So the problem is that it thinks we let go because we actually did let go. So I couldn't get it to work with both because it kept trying to end the ability, which makes sense. So yeah, if anyone has figured that out, please share in the comments. What we're going to do next is that we will add a condition for if the sprint wants to be on tap or on hold. So what we can do is we can add a boolean to our hero sprint for now, just to make sure. For now, just for a first iteration. So is tap input. Okay, so depending on if it's tap input or not. So if it's true, then we will jump to the wait input press. Okay, and if it's false, we will wait for the input release. And then we'll unhook this. And that should do it. Okay, and then I will default it to true because I personally like tapping to sprint. It gives me less of a cramp in my hand. Okay, and then in our sprint, that's where something new that I've learned comes in. We're actually going to create our own trigger. So for now, I'm just going to delete all of these. Okay, and then I will add a new that's right, I don't think you can create it from here. Delete that. Save. Okay, and minimize this. And I guess we could put it with the input actions. Let's go ahead and add a new folder and then trigger. And then in the trigger, I will create our new input trigger. So I'm gonna search for input, and then, or let's go ahead and create a new blueprint class. And then if we search for input trigger, I've noticed that the hold one is a time base, so this is why I made this one a input trigger time base. Let's go ahead and select that. And then input trigger time base, so ITT. I didn't see any rules about naming for input trigger time base or input triggers. Tap or hold, and then sprint. Because in my case, I'm going to actually have it be based on a user game setting. Okay, let's go ahead and open that up. And then we're gonna want to override our update state. Okay, and then this whole bit, I essentially just use the code from C++ for both the down trigger and the tap trigger, and I just pretty much translated it into Blueprint and just made sure that I can use both, or the logic is there for both. Okay, so we're going to add a branch and then promote to variable. So I'm just going to add this is tap. Okay, so just for visibility, adding it to the sprint. So now I can see it in here. So tap or hold sprint. So you'll see that the option is right there. So it can be on or off. And the rest of the options are very similar to what we've seen before. Okay, so I'll start with a false. So is actuated. So this whole bit is literally just, the logic from C++. Okay, so every time it updates, it checks, is it still on? So if it's true, then you want to return that you're triggered. So you're triggered, we're good. Okay, and if it's false, then we want to return none. So this essentially is your on released, and it will call your on released event. And that's it for the down logic. I will just surround it with comments. So C down logic. And then for the other one, for the tap, it uses variables that we can tweak. Okay, so for the tap, it uses a few variables. So some of them already exist. So get held duration. Okay, so I want to promote this to a variable because I want to cache the last held duration. So last held duration. Okay, and oh, actually this should happen after. I want to cache this held duration before we call the parent function, and then we'll set the state. We'll also state. So we'll cache also the state. So promote to variable, and I'll call this one state. Okay, and then we'll add a branch. So we would just want to see, was it a tap? So last value. So you can get the last value. And then this one, so if your previous value was actuated, so it was down, and your state is none. Have you let go of the button? And the last thing is we want to check another condition. So if your last held duration is smaller, then that's your new variable you need to create. So I will create a tap release time threshold. So it's good to keep the same names as what the tap had. So I'm gonna plug that in. Okay, so if all of these conditions are met, then we succeeded in doing a tap. So we can return trigger. So I'm gonna just set the state. So set the state to triggered. We could just have a return node here, but I will just make sure they all get to the same return node. Okay, so if it's false, then we'll just have a branch. Okay. So if the held duration is bigger or equal to the tap release time threshold, so in that case, you were holding down the input too long, then a tap event will not happen. So we want to set the status to none. Okay. And then we want to essentially just return our state. Okay. So all of this logic here is for the tap. So tap input logic. Yeah, so essentially if you want a tap event, you'll go through here and you just make sure, okay, did this tap work and was it within the threshold? If not, then just have the trigger be on release or just have a state of none. Okay, and if you want to hold, then you just make sure that it is held. Okay, so let's test this out. So in your input sprint, oh, last held duration probably, thank you, probably doesn't need to be exposed here. So I wonder if I can make this into, okay, there you go, private. Hopefully it doesn't show up. So it still shows up. Okay, so your last held duration in your state, it's probably better that they are just local variables. So let's go back here and okay, so the easiest way to do this is just adding a 1 at the end. And then I wish we could just do that, but we need to add it. So last held duration and then state. So let's copy, paste. Oh. Paste local variable. So state. Okay, and then I will try to just replace them. So I'll just search all the ones. I wish there was a nicer way to do this. So I just drag it in. Last held duration. And I think that's it. Oh no, state. There's another one. And right here. So sometimes you just have to right click on it and refresh node. And then same with this one, refresh node. And refresh node. Okay, it seems fine now. So I'll go ahead and delete these two variables over here. and it is in use. So let me find the reference, set state. Okay, so let's go and change this node and then refresh this node. And then what we wanted here was triggered. Okay, so let me just go ahead and delete that. Okay, and then inner sprint. Ah, there you go. It's nice and clean. No need to see our local variables. Yeah, so I will. It might be nice to have nice default settings like the tap does. So I'll just click on tap just to see what theirs are. So 0.2 is the time threshold. Okay, so I'm gonna go ahead and have that same default value. So 0.2, compile, save, IA sprint. I will delete this. Good day. And there you go. Okay, now we have our custom trigger. So if it's tap, let's see what happens. Okay, so I'll do God mode. I tap again. Okay, seems like it works really nice. I'll stop this. And then if it's false, now the trick here, it's a little not fun, is that you also have to change it in your input or in your ability. Okay, so let me play. Sprint has been activated. I have the input pressed. I let go and it works nice. Okay, so the next part of this video, we are actually going to add a gameplay setting so that the player themselves can set if they want a tap or a hold. So it'll be up to them. And so this is very much based on the previous video I released about game settings. Yeah, I'll still share the code in my video description. So let's go ahead and stop this simulation. Okay, so let's go ahead and open the project in my case writer. So generate, it could be your Visual Studio project. So I'm gonna just do this. When that's ready, just open up writer. Okay, and then once that loads, open up your projects. So Sprint Lyra for me, source, Lyra game, and then under settings, and then the gameplay is the screen that we saw earlier. So we're going to just add a section. So you can go ahead and paste the code that I shared in my video description. So right after the replay subsection, okay, so right here and right before screen, you can go ahead and paste this. And okay. And then we just need to add this setting to our local settings. So I'm gonna go ahead and navigate to your Lyra settings local. Okay, and then you can paste the section for the sprint. So right under replays to keep. Okay, so let's add. Okay, so essentially it just adds this setting that is just use tap for sprint. And that's right, I'd like to default it to true. And then another thing I noticed is that if I wanted to get this variable, there was no way of calling it. Because the Lyra settings local were not a blueprint type. Okay, so what I had to do is I had to make it a blueprint type so we can cast our game user settings to it. So yeah, there was no example of any property that's being used at blueprint. So this, almost this here. Yeah, it was all used in C++. Even though there's a bunch of blueprint callable. So unless I'm missing something, but this was my solution for that. And then it's good to just comment why you did the changes you did, if ever you're getting the most up-to-date Lyra game. So I'm just going to go ahead and close this and run from the code. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and just run. Okay, so back in the project. Now let's go ahead and open your tap or hold input action. Okay, and then our sprint ability. So GA hero sprint. So instead of using a bool, what we could do is we could get that user setting. So I'm gonna just search what it was called. Okay, so let's turn off the context sensitive, just so we can call our function directly. So this is how we will find out if the user wants to, or if the player wants to use the tap for sprint. So let's click on that. And then now it's good to turn back on the context sensitive. So this one takes a Lyra settings local. So to find the game user settings, so you can call get game user settings. Okay, so this will return the game's local machine settings. And since we have our own, the Lyra game settings, we're just going to go ahead and cast to the Lyra settings local. Okay, so that's how you get your Lyra settings local. So I will just move all of this over there. Make some space for this. Okay, so this probably only needs to be set once, but it's good to have it here because the player might turn that on as they're playing. Okay, so instead of is tap input, we're going to use this here. Maybe what we could do is that if that fails, we could always just just use the is tap input. So if the cast fails, I'm going to have another branch and then essentially do the same thing. It's getting a little tangled here. So true, false. So you can clean it up, set it the way you'd like. So that took care of the gameplay ability one. And now we can copy the same logic for the input. So I'm going to go ahead and select all of these and paste them over here. So again, I'll make some space. Okay, and paste. Okay, so when you update, you try to get the setting. So if that cast failed, oh boy, what's going on? So if that cast failed, we're just going to use the is tap. Okay, so I'm just going to add a point here and over there. So you can organize it the way you want. This is a little bit noodly in my opinion, and a bit hard to read. Okay, so now it should be based on what settings they have. So let's test this out. So when I play, so we won't have any movement here. I'm just going to go ahead and open our shooter gym. Okay, and let's play. And since it's a local setting, it should work also in multiplayer. Okay, so I'm tapping it. It works. Okay. And when I escape, options. So gameplay tap to sprint is on. I'll turn that off and apply. So now I have the input held down. I let go. It's been deactivated. So yay, now we have a way to empower the player to choose how they want to sprint. So yeah, it's nice to give as many options as you can to your players, so they can play your game the way they want. And also for accessibility, I gotta say, my pinky cramps up if I have to hold shift for too long. It's also a preference. But yeah, I think I'm beginning to understand well input actions, and it's been interesting to try to figure this out. Um, and yeah, I hope you learned as much as I did. As always, thanks for watching and see you in the next one.